A quick word before we get into this week's episode. I was talking to a head of school recently who said, Peter, we've got a strong strategic plan, but every time we try to act on it, things stall. If that sounds familiar, you're not alone. Big goals are easy to write down, but they often get bogged down in the daily, making it hard to stay strategic. That's why I built the school operating system. It's a framework that helps you align your team and focus your priorities so you can actually execute the plan. We work alongside you to extrapolate a one-year plan from your existing strategic plan, break it into 90-day sprints, and design a much more effective meeting rhythm that moves your team closer to your strategic vision every single day. And that's just the start. We support much more to help you build the operational infrastructure your plan needs to succeed. If you're serious about making traction this year, let's talk. Visit moonshotos.com/SOS. That's MOONSHOTOS.com/SOS to learn more and set up a time to chat about the school operating system. Hi there, my friend. I'm Peter Barron. Welcome to today's episode of the Independent School Moonshot Podcast. I'm thrilled to be joined by Cara Gallagher, founder at CGC, where she consults on organizational health with schools and other organizations. Cara had reached out to me about a year ago. We had a really neat conversation around this topic of organizational health. I know she's been listening to the podcast, so thank you very much. I appreciate that. And we had another conversation recently about some of the work that she's done. She's a student of the science of work, which I'm super excited to learn more about. And clearly this question of, talent management and creating great places to work and faculty retention and recruitment is something that we've touched on multiple times over the podcast. So I'm excited to dig into this with Cara right now. Cara Gallagher, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Peter, friend of the pod.
A friend of the pod. Yeah, that's great. You're the first person that said that. That's awesome.
Friend of the pod.
Before we get going, can you introduce yourself to the audience and tell us a little bit more about CGC?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Cara. I'm the founder of CGC. Basically, what I enjoy doing there is I combine data and psychology and strategy to help schools strengthen their culture and ideally lead meaningful change. My background comes from education. I spent 2 decades in public and independent schools, both as a teacher and an administrator. And more recently, the past 2 years, I really dove into that science of work that you were talking about, which just specifically means a master's in industrial organizational psychology. So CGC was born out of what I saw as a need, firsthand as a teacher and an administrator, which was schools struggling to find alignments, particularly among their leaders, the culture, and strategy in a way that supports both the people and organizational effectiveness overall. So I use psychometrics, which is just a fancy term for tailored surveys, questionnaires, and other diagnostics, institutional research and evidence that I've accumulated through my studies in academia to help school leaders, make informed decisions about trust, change, and engagement.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And we're going to get into all of that, but I'd love to break down the science of work a little bit more. And I know you gave kind of a high level overview about what it is, but can you dig a little deeper? I'm so curious about it.
Yeah. So the science of work is really the study of how people thrive or don't thrive in their workplace. It's rooted in industrial organizational, psychology, which looks at everything from motivation to communication to, the manifestations of problematic workplace dynamics like burnout and turnover. It's not just theory, it's practical, it's research backed, insights into basically what makes an organization function well and the people inside that organization, obviously the talent, thrive ideally. My job is to take the science, translate it into, something that schools can use, specifically leaders, so that they can make better decisions about talent, leadership, and particularly change, which is so much a big, part of organizational health.
How do you break that? Like, what would that look like, at a school, like at a high level?
Well, it could be, doing some sort of assessment to see I would say the readiness for change is probably a common assessment that might be done in a science of work type study. It's not uncommon to, endeavor to change something. Maybe you want to point the ship in a new direction as a school. And often this might happen with a, high level strategic plan or some other, maybe a leadership transition or something big that's coming. And in doing so, rather than just kind of pointing that ship and assuming the boat is healthy and ready to go, this, work, the industrial organizational psychologist in me would do a pretty full scale evaluation of the health of that boat and all the people on it to see like, okay, if we're pointing it in that direction, are we ready? Do we have the appropriate people? Do we have the culture that is going to carry this change? And or make this new leader effective and successful? What are the other metrics and what are the other, sort of data points that we need to know in order to decide if the timing of this transition or change is optimal?
That's so interesting because, I have this thing called the school operating system. We come in behind the strategic plan to help schools execute, build the systems in order to make sure that that's done at a high level. But what I'm hearing you say is, okay, even before you get to that,
Mhm.
like you've got to make sure that you have folks who are A, understanding it and appreciate it and are aligned with it. Because if you don't, like, then what happens?
Right. Yeah, I mean, change management is a science. There is an actual field of research around change management. That's something that I have very much focused my academic studies on the last couple of years. If you look at big companies and businesses and organizations out there, before they endeavor to make any kind of change, even if it's a smaller, relatively, minor one, they typically have some sort of a actual plan. There are not number of frameworks and models out there. The agile model is one that people tend to have heard of before. There's an ADKAR model. There's Kotter's 8 steps. There are a lot of different like formal ones that are used in different sectors and fields to map a change process. And a big, important step is that sort of early stage employee listening assessments of the employee experience, leadership, to understand that readiness for change as a way of ultimately deciding if it's effective and successful by the end. Not even really by the end, actually. It's iterative. So along the way, you're measuring it to make sure that, if it's not going well, that you're making changes and adapting.
Yeah, I would also imagine, if you're doing that work, you're going to realize, oh boy, we may have like people who are ready to leave and we weren't even aware of it.
Absolutely. Employee listening campaigns are also pretty common out there. I wouldn't say I heard of many of them at schools, but certainly, at large companies. I was at the Society of Industrial Organizational Psychologists conference in April in Denver. And one of the people I really enjoyed talking to was the VP of employee listening at Goldman Sachs, who gave me, 30 minutes of his time and basically explained, okay, here's exactly how we do employee listening here so that, we know where people are. We're, understanding and listening to in a very purposeful, intentional way what the experience is like. It also very much helps them predict and track things like turnover, attrition, retention rates. And it also helps them with, strategic employee planning too, not just planning for someone at a high level is leaving, but, although it might do that, it's also planning for the skills and roles that they'll predict in the future that they'll need. I mean, it's especially important right now too. I know with, so many economic changes going on and affecting sizes of employees and talent, on staff that it's really helpful. It's really something that I would, hope more schools would consider doing.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I like to do with this pod is to bring ideas outside of our industry and try to contextualize them for independent schools. And talking about this employee listening concept, like what might that look like at a school?
So an employee listening strategy is one that typically does involve, you need an as someone to kind of lead the charge on that, or at least, folks who are interested in doing it in the first place. I think something I've learned is never ask someone a question that you don't want to hear the answer to. So there's a certain preparation that needs to go into it in terms of who you're going to charge with that task. Maybe it's an HR person, maybe it's a division head, or someone who has access to institutional research for sure, to kind of help kick that process off and really start to design and think about what it is that needs to be asked in order to assess and determine employees, and talents, levels of engagement. Perhaps, job satisfaction is a pretty common one to measure as part of an employee listening campaign or strategy. And also things like turnover or intent to leave, because, I talk a lot, I've researched a lot about specifically teacher burnout. I actually did a big research paper recently on teacher burnout. But I also really started looking at, some of the antecedents of that. And a lot of it has to do with, some of the anecdotal signs of intent to leave, which are often apparent before someone actually comes in and says, hey, so this is going to be my last year, or I'll be leaving, and or I'm quitting
In
immediately.
2025, I'm leaving at the end of the day.
Well, yeah. I mean, we know that we definitely know that happens.
Yeah, that
Gosh,
happens,
I mean,
yeah.
and frankly, that's a worst case scenario. That there's that one is one that hopefully is so sort of anomalous that maybe there are some other circumstances that went into that decision. But for the ones that are surprises and could have been perhaps tracked backwards to see what leaving signals were present that may have signaled to a leader or HR person or manager, coming down the pike here, we have someone who's thinking about leaving, then perhaps that could have been avoided in the first place. That sudden, shocking, today's my last day, I'm out.
Yeah, you definitely want to avoid that. What could some of those signals be?
So, leaving signals are they can be somewhat anecdotal. I do, definitely like to offer, empirical and or, evidence-based science, but, typically I would start with conversations about, it's usually a manager or a leader who has some fears that maybe people are unhappy or that, someone is thinking about quitting. And while those often are emotional conversations that need to be had to get to the, why behind that theory, there's also the anecdotal and sometimes even harder evidence that I think a leader could, use to better understand the truth to that theory. Leaving signals are subtle indicators that someone is on their way out. So whether they be, mentally or physically, it could be something like less participation in meetings, a drop in effort, changes in overall tone and attitude, withdrawal from social and or required events, a general lack of communication, things like a decrease in the number of correspondence and emails responded to, or the amount of time it takes for someone to respond. Increased absenteeism is a big, leaving signal, and just general disengagement. I tend to think that these signals are far more visible to peers or direct managers than someone who's at that high level of an HR person or a head.
Right.
And so schools could track these by maybe training division directors, heads, or sorry, not heads, chairs, to observe those shifts and, use something smaller like a pulse survey to track engagement and perhaps flag disengagement. There's also, always opportunities, I think, to create systems where employees can voice frustrations early versus trying to gather data when you suspect there's a problem or person or people are leaving. It's a lot, better, I think, to set something in place early on where people can continually have those sources to share out, their experience.
It strikes me that needs to be supported by a very deliberate mindset at the head level. That you are open to this, that you welcome this kind of feedback, that you model that behavior so that it cascades throughout the organization. I mean, is that a fair read?
It is. I'll be honest, I might throw the occasional hot take in here or there, but let's make the podcast interesting.
Oh, this is
I
the social promo right here. Yeah.
I think that while it would be great if a head could do that, and certainly they should model that, psychological safety we're talking about, freedom to share, freedom to be open, without, fear of retaliation and repercussions. I mean, heads are tasked with so much.
Yeah.
It's, I really do think that if we're going to focus all of our efforts on it being on their shoulders, then no, it's just not possible. And, that's also not, I would say, a sustainable model. That's what you tasked your senior leaders with, I would think, too. And even further down in that, org chart, so that that knowledge sharing is possible and feeds up and can be perhaps remedied by a collaborative effort versus just the head kind of coming in and being the person, the soothsayer who takes care of that or prevents people from doing it. I think that great leaders obviously are going to make people stay and more inclined to stay longer, but there are a lot of other people that talent work for and or with that are just as likely to affect or impact the longevity of a person at a workplace or their job as anything else.
I mean, that's why construction of a team is so important.
Absolutely.
And now a word from our sponsor. Leading a school today can mean juggling a dozen different systems across offices, finance, fundraising, marketing, enrollment, and academics, all pulling your attention in different directions. At Blackbaud, we believe it shouldn't be that way. That's why we built Blackbaud's Total School Solution. It's a fully connected solution designed for private and independent school leaders who want a clear view of their entire operation. From tuition to transcript to donation, you get one ecosystem, one login, and one source of truth. This isn't about more software. It's about smarter strategy. When your systems work together, you spend less time chasing down data and more time leading. Want to see what Blackbaud's Total School Solution could do for your school? Visit blackbaud.com. That's BLACKBAUD.com to learn more.
Absolutely. Turnover is, according to the research, contagious. It's not just an individual decision, it tends to be very social one. That's why, I in looking at some of the research on this, it tends to be a very social thing. And that's why, that the anecdotal data is there, and should also be backed up by, some hard evidence. But, just simply talking to people and gathering that intel, think about a time when you weren't happy at work. Did you keep it to yourself? No. You probably complained to a colleague or a peer about it. That's human. That's what we do. But, when done consistently over time, it can have some incredibly harmful effects. I think the truth is that when a respected leader or a respected teacher or individual leaves, it sends a powerful message, and has such a ripple effect across the entire, talent across the entire organization. And, that message is soundly that this is not working for me anymore for whatever reason. And that can start to plant seeds of doubt in others, and, really negatively impact morale and climate.
Talk to me about invisible resistance to change. What does that look like?
So, as I was talking about, I have a small passion for change management and understanding, exactly how people move through change successfully. What are the, facets of it that make it work? I've done a lot of research on it. And over the past, I think, year or so, one of the antecedents of failed change initiatives that often comes up in the research is this phenomenon of invisible resistance. To give you an example, it's like when a decision or an initiative is made at the top, but the execution of it falls flat or just never gets off the ground because those tasked with delivery, specifically talent or other leaders, minimally or passively implement it, or they found a way to, which is kind of more common, I think, in schools, keep the status quo. Invisible resistance often shows up in various passive behaviors like silence in meetings, missed deadlines, or that sort of like smile and nod approach, with no real buy-in. I think it's important to note that it's not always maliciously done. There isn't always malice of intent motivating it. It's often done for self-protection. Or someone is experiencing high levels of fatigue, you know, loss of institutional trust, some other organizational dysfunction. But, faculty, I think in particular, may fear speaking up or feel changes being done to them rather than with them. And I think the key is to try to surface those early resistance, movements or motions through anonymous feedback, facilitated conversation, some sort of diagnostic, and treat it not as defiance per se. It's usually a signal of a need for, greater clarity and or understanding of, timelines and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that speaks to, if you're a leader at a school or you're on a leadership team and you hear this a lot, like, oh gosh, they just make all decisions behind a closed door and they're not like, we don't even know what they're doing, right? Like
Yeah.
that I imagine that could probably feed into this. I've never heard this term invisible resistance, but it really is clicking for me. Like it's got to feed into that.
Absolutely. I think it's especially key. So many schools I've seen over the last few years really try to move towards integrating innovation and or acting in ways that are innovative. If you have, a group of individuals who are tasked with, creating this, implementing this innovation in the school, there's nothing worse than like minimal buy-in because you will have minimal effectiveness and no innovation can grow in spaces where you have, those conditions in place.
So you'd said just a minute or so ago, you talked about, maybe you do a survey, put it out there to kind of start to collect this information to understand if invisible resistance is emerging. What are examples of some questions they could ask?
So, I had spent a lot of time studying the design and creation of surveys. And, I just want to say that, it's really important to, I think, for people to think always about, what it is they're trying to get out of a survey question. What is the validity and the reliability of these questions here to the extent that that's possible. Because, the last thing I would want is for someone to put a survey out there that's a little bit haphazard and that, doesn't get high participation and falls flat and does nothing. Because, something that kind of drives me crazy is this conversation about survey fatigue. I think it's actually like survey inaction that really, affects someone's likelihood of completing a survey and reporting and sharing what their experience is like. And, in some organizations, regular efforts to collect intel on what the experience is like or how well something is working or not working are done on such a frequent basis that people are like, we just got one of these last week. That's the world I come from, on the academic side, where people are doing it so frequently that it is weekly. On the education side and the work I've done with schools, that tends not to be the case at all. And in fact, when you start to ask people about their experience and or what they think about something, they love it because they're like, we don't get to do this very often. And or, the last time I got a survey was a year ago and it was, just the basic climate survey. So frequent, small pulse checks, I think, are incredibly effective and very common in the world of, organizational psychology. So doing something like a basic, I think, job satisfaction survey and or general climate survey, might help folks measure some of the things that we're talking about here. And they will also potentially open the door to some signs or some signals of not only people leaving, but also invisible resistance. I think it's a gateway opportunity to collect this info and find out the extent to which it's happening. So, asking questions like, do you feel your contributions are heard? Do you feel that they are recognized in some way? How clear are you on the direction of the school? If you had any concerns, would you feel comfortable raising them? These are just a few general questions that I think would, kind of assess and help, those trying to collect this data better consider what it is they're trying to mine for with a survey. It's just, a helpful way to be really, I think, intentional about the type of information you're collecting.
Yeah, and the key though is if you're collecting the information, you have to do something with it.
Yes. Well, yeah, you should. I mean, if nothing else, you need to, I think, tell folks what it is for, the intent of it.
Yeah.
And if you want to put out and assign those expectations that you will hear back in some formal presentation of, the findings of this survey on X date or at such and such time, go for it. But I'm always a proponent of never, over promising and under delivering. So if it is a pulse check, it really is just intended to take the pulse on what people are thinking and or experiencing about something specific and in particular. And it's
Yeah.
fair to say, I think, in the design of that, like, here's what it's for. It is just for this. Okay. And if we, I think it's so important for people to know that, a survey or questionnaire is a conversation starter. It is not the final outcome. It is intended to learn more in a safe way so that people have some sense of confidence and or anonymity, if that's possible, to share what is going on with them. And then, what you plan to do with that. Yes, try to be honest with them about it. But again, I feel like the more people do this and collect this data, the more fluid people will be with it and understand what its intent is and whether or not they're going to get something for it.
What strikes me about all of this is like the work. This work is not easy. Like
Right.
it's very complex, and I'm
Mhm.
sure a lot of moving parts, and it's probably hard to say, hey, we're going to have a committee that manages all of this, just because building momentum can be challenging if you don't have somebody thinking about it all the time. So I know you advocate for schools to create roles like director of people of culture, maybe a chief people officer. And in fact, I've actually done a podcast on why every independent school should have a chief people officer with Min Kim, who used to be the chief people officer at Avenues in New York.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is? Like, why do you advocate for that?
I mean, I think it's essential. When we think about the future of schools and the future roles, to me, this is top of mind. I think because schools are thriving, breathing human systems, and yet, they rarely have leadership roles that are dedicated to the human experience of work, that they're even more needed. And in light of especially the last few years, amidst or post COVID,
Yeah.
I think there's been a lot of discoveries about, the impact of the experience. I mean, you know, this is not meant to be a criticism of leaders or human resources directors or deans of faculty too, who are very much, I think, often the ones tasked or charged with this type of work. It's just that, what I've learned from being in an academic program studying organizational behavior the past 2 years is that, thriving companies, the ones that are on, consistently the Fortune 100 best places to work list or the great place to work, database, they all gather insights about their people in order to nurture the thrivability of that environment. And, I couldn't look away from, those findings and that data and not think like, why aren't schools doing this too? And, how can I help them to do this?
Yeah.
I know. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, and it's not just schools, right? It's like
Sure. Of
industry after industry after industry could
Yeah.
benefit from this. And my guess is that it's not the norm. It's more the exception when you see these kinds of programs in place. I mean,
Right.
I guess what I'm trying to say is it's still very early.
Right. I agree. I predict that, if we're projecting ahead, I predict that in the hopefully not too distant future, schools will be hiring directors of people and culture, or directors of organizational strategy or chief people and innovation officer to do this work. These roles I think would ensure that, decisions about culture, talent, change aren't left to chance or added on, after the fact, because there's been a crisis or some flashpoint, inciting incident that has really thwarted efforts to innovate and to be, thoughtful and visionary. But if schools want to retain great people and they want to stay agile, I think they need that internal capacity that's focused on those goals year after year.
Yeah. Talk to me about some myths about turnover at schools. Like what are some myths that people may be holding on to that they potentially could let go of?
Okay. So the big one, I was thinking about this recently and wrote a little something about, the one myth is that people leave for more money. I think that that is true sometimes, but more often they leave because they felt undervalued or unheard or misaligned. There's an old saying that you don't quit a job, you quit a boss. I think that there's more to just pay them more money. Now, obviously in schools and education, we're talking about individuals who have been like historically, I think, not paid enough. So that is different if there is a real big jump to be made. But the research overwhelmingly shows that, satisfaction with your workplace plateaus after you've received a bump in pay. Like this is kind of irrespective of wherever you work, no matter how much more you get, you will plateau. That will over time, not turn into lasting happiness with your job or keep you there forever. I think another myth is that, this is something I hear a lot, particularly at schools, is like, well, turnover is inevitable, especially after the pandemic. It's not. You can influence it too. Like you have control. There is an agency in this. Turnover is a symptom of deeper issues, I think, that can be addressed. I think that, there's a big misconception that if people aren't complaining, everything's fine. That's the one that worries me, the most. That's the one I feel the most passion to help others, leaders with. Silence is not the same as satisfaction. It in fact might mean that people have checked out. It could mean the opposite of what you think. So, and there's other, I think, myths too. I think that there's just not enough strong empirical findings to show that servant leadership styles correlate with low turnover, which is something that I think a lot of heads and leaders talk about is, the need and the drive that, servant leadership keeps people long term. And I've just not found that to be true. I think the issue of talent cannot rest solely, again, on the hands of just a school head. It's too much, and they're too busy.
Oh, you need the structures and systems in place.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I'm curious about teacher burnout because I know you've studied that too. What are some of the signals there, and do you have ways in which schools can begin to counter it, prevent it?
Yeah, that was some tough research, to do just because it's pretty scary, the findings. Burnout has become a pretty common term in the parlance of our times. And so I decided to focus one of two research projects this previous semester on the studies, the findings about specifically pre-K through 12 teacher burnout. There was a study in Gallup from 2022 that found 52% of pre-K through 12th grade teachers reported feeling burned out. So it's important, I think, to reframe this not as a personal shortcoming or personal failure, but a widespread crisis. I think it shows, the textbook definition of burnout is extreme exhaustion combined with high levels of cynicism. And a third component, although less so to a high degree, is a low efficacy. It emerges specifically in teachers when the demands and the rewards of teaching are chronically misaligned with the teacher's expectations and values. So I think preventing it, to answer your second question there, starts with, first of all, measuring it and tracking for it before it even gets to that point. I think the hardest part for me in the research is that it's extremely hard to recover from burnout. There is no cure, to my knowledge. In many cases, people who are, who reach that point of chronic, burnout, they do quit, they do leave. And in some cases, they leave the field completely. So, addressing things like workload, which tends to lead to the extreme exhaustion antecedent of burnout, but also improving the relational environment, since so much of it is also dependent upon this high cynicism, I think is really an important, framework to keep in mind. Clarity of roles, supportive leadership, sense of meaning in the work, and a degree of organizational justice. In some cases, burnout is a component of there being pretty serious distrust and, and a sense of unfairness in the organization.
It's such an interesting point you make. Burnout, they're tired, they become cynical, And, I get it. Like it's a hard place to be in, especially like if you think about post COVID or during COVID and beyond, we've just asked teachers to do more. We've layered on, independent schools are notorious for wearing, having faculty and staff wear lots of hats, but like we're wearing more hats now, and
Absolutely.
it doesn't take long to like figure out there's more things that we have to do. But the problem is, a lot of those things that we're asking teachers to become more expert in, like SEL, for example, right? Super important. The kids need it. Like I see it with my own kids. Like it's just like it's critical.
Mhm.
The problem though is, these programs don't necessarily add to revenue.
I know.
So we're not generating more revenue to be able to fully staff our schools, to be able to reduce the burnout load because we're taking things off people's plates. And, that's really hard. And, it's why I try to talk with schools, but you have to be very clear on your priorities. You have to like audit what you're doing and understand like, what can you leave behind, as you try to move forward. And, it's just like it's a very tricky balance, very tricky balance.
I agree. It's critical though. I mean, if it, the number of times that I hear and see also in various, trend books, the number one concern is loss of talent. Then, focusing on making these types of initiatives, SEL programs, both for students and, for the adults in the building too, wellness commitments, things like that. Just even, sometimes I'll be honest, like sometimes adding more of those and the costs that come with them is not necessarily the way that you get there. I'm a fan and a proponent of starting first with where we are and really learning, getting clear through the institutional research and data that we have in-house, that we can collect and use in-house, where things are and how do we lift up, the good things that are happening, but also really focus on specific to the culture in this school. What do we need to do to improve it? And that means obviously then having the right people who have, I think, that knowledge and or that EQ, and the time and the resources to do that, and or if you can't, bring someone in who can help you with that, because sometimes just piling on, bringing on these extra outside programs might feel more like a box that was checked than an actual effective intervention.
Cara, this has been great. I really appreciate you sharing. Like, my mind is racing, so I can't wait to listen to this again later. But one last question for you: if a head of school listened to this and said, this is really interesting. I'm curious about the science of work, but I'm not sure even where to begin. Like, what's the first thing they should be thinking about?
So I would say to start listening differently. I don't think that there is a head out there who wouldn't say they do listen, they try, but that there are different ways to listening to gather that, knowledge and share that knowledge. Don't wait for a crisis. Don't wait for, someone to really share how they feel about what's going on in the workplace for the organization through the exit interview. Use structured tools, surveys or stakeholder interviews or behavioral data to understand, how your people are experiencing work and experiencing, school. And then get curious, not defensive, which, can be
Right.
a real challenge, a real process. Sometimes the findings that come, especially if there hasn't been a practice of doing that type of work historically, and you're starting to ask people, what's going on? What do you think? And they kind of, let it rip and unleash some negative things that you didn't know about. Staying in that curious mindset is incredibly important, and really kind of mitigating the defensive, nature when you are taking that in about what you hear. I think that curiosity can really serve as the doorway to healthier teams and better decisions and hopefully lasting positive change.
That's great. I said that was my last question. I do have one more. Cara, if somebody wants to reach out and connect with you, what are the best ways for them to do that?
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn. You can, certainly reach out to me and find me there. I also, I think I post to my Substack where people can find me, and Cara Gallagher Consulting.com is my website. Look me up there. I'm
Awesome.
happy to
Cara,
help with this
yeah,
work.
please do, everybody. Cara Gallagher, founder of CGC Consulting. Thank you again. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you.